Gale Force is the signature attraction at Playland's Castaway Cove in Ocean City, New Jersey. This S&S multi-pass launch coaster was the company's answer to Premier Ride's Skyrocket 2 coaster. It was designed to be a clonable, super compact coaster packing a lot of thrills into a small footprint. And the coaster currently is a lot of fun. So that begs the question, why aren't there more S&S coasters like Gale Force? Well, maybe that's because the ride didn't used to be a lot of fun. And the ride's construction was a comedy of errors. Before there was West Coast Racers, there was Gale Force. Gale Force was supposed to open in 2016. However, the opening was delayed a full year until 2017 due to countless issues, most notably a faulty track piece that needed to be replaced. Now, I rode Gale Force in 2017, and this is something I have to ask. How bad was that track piece if it needed to be replaced? Because the Gale Force I rode in 2017 was really bumpy and shaky, so I shudder to think how bad that piece must have been. And the complaints about roughness weren't just coming from seasoned enthusiasts. Even Playland's Castaway Cove realized something was wrong with their brand new attraction. That's why they had S&S replace the entire track in the 2017 to 2018 off-season. That was an unprecedented move for a one-year-old coaster, but the park said the ride's rails were misaligned, which caused the bumpy rides. And the park's retracking certainly paid off. Anyone who rode Gale Force before the 2018 season, myself included, were not big fans of the ride. But anyone who has ridden Gale Force since 2018 has had nothing but positive things to say about this demented little ride, myself included. And the reviews are even more positive if they rode it from the 2019 season onward. For the 2019 season, Gale Force started giving double rides, and that really helps make Gale Force a better value since every ride in this coaster costs a whopping $10, so doubling the ride time is a big deal. Gale Force is an imposing looking coaster. The ride has a sleek blue track and a twisted mess of steel. It also helps that you have Wild Waves, the miler coaster, wrapped around Gale Force. For this reason, Gale Force has a very strict loose article policy. Everything must go in a bin. Phones, wallets, keys. The staff will wand you down the station with metal detectors. Glasses with a strap were allowed, but bizarrely, masks were not allowed when I rode it in 2020, even though they were secured in a similar manner to my glasses strap. That sort of irked me, especially because they were loading every single row. Despite the short 12-person trains and wanding of passengers, Gale Force typically has pretty fast dispatches. Gale Force often has a large and efficient crew, so there is very little time in between dispatches. That keeps the line moving even on a busy summer night. And the park certainly has the incentive to keep the line moving on their most popular attraction, since Playland's Castaway Cove has no pay-one-price wristband, so time really is money for Gale Force. Now let's talk about the trains, because they really are bizarre. The ride has 3 rows seating 4 riders in each row. One of the weirdest parts is that the train is comprised of 2 cars. The first 2 rows are part of one car, and the back row is its own separate car. This looks really strange in close-ups when the coaster is articulating, but it makes sense why this was needed when you see how tight some of these elements are. The position of riders is also quite strange. Gale Force has 4 across seating despite fairly narrow track gauge. In order to accommodate the 4 across trains, Gale Force's trains are raised up quite a bit above the track. But one thing I have an issue with is how low the seats rest relative to the floor of the train. You really sink down into these seats, and I found it awkward how I had to angle and position my legs to ride. It felt really unnatural. One thing I don't take issue with are the restraints. Gale Force has the same vest restraints as the S&S free spins, so while they are a bit restrictive, they are super comfortable. Gale Force starts with the multi-pass launch, and I hate to say it, the launch still isn't very good. And that's really shocking because of how powerful S&S launches traditionally are. But one of the biggest differences with Gale Force is that this is a multi-pass magnetic launch, as opposed to their compressed air launches you find on coasters like Powder Keg or Dodonampa. On Gale Force, the launch is pretty forceless. Not only that, it sort of has a rattle to it. As a whole, the retracking made Gale Force a very smooth coaster, but the launch still doesn't feel as smooth as it should be. It's oddly the roughest part of the ride. The only part of the launch sequence that I enjoy is the tiny bit of float on the forward and backward stalls after the first and second launches respectively. After the third launch, you reach the max speed of 64 miles per hour and rocket up a 125-foot tall twisting top hat. And the apex of this hill is ridiculously tight. That, combined with the speed you crested at, results in some very powerful and sustained ejector airtime. The airtime is sustained even longer if you're in the back, since the subsequent drop is actually beyond vertical. The pullout from this top hat has some really strong G-forces. It's at this point I believe the coaster pulls the advertised 4 Gs. I started to gray out on all my rides at this point. That's followed by the second hill, which is called a kickflip. This element is profiled similarly to an Immelman, except the track twists at the top, so you never fully invert. And because the drop off this element is both very steep and simultaneously twisting, it delivers a delightful mix of laterals and strong ejector airtime. The third hill is a smaller kickflip. This one has a shorter drop on the other side, so the ejector airtime is much more brief, but it's still very powerful. And you also don't have the laterals here since the drop lacks the twist of the prior hill. The fourth hill is a dive drop, which is basically the reverse of a kickflip. It's a dive loop where you never invert, but rather you twist at the top. The drop is very disorienting because of how quickly you twist towards the ground, and it's paired with some really faint weightlessness sensations. You then dive back into the station, and remember, you are sent through the layout a second time, so you get to repeat all those great elements again. Gale Force is an absolute rush. All of the individual elements after the launch are extremely disorienting because of their wonky profiling and compactness. Many of these elements look and sort of feel like inversions even though you technically never invert. And you have no recovery time in between elements. They all come in rapid fire succession one after another. My first ride on Gale Force was a complete blur because of how fast and intense it felt. So what would I rate Gale Force? Based off the retracking that was done in the double cycle, I would give this coaster an 8 out of 10. Gale Force is one wild ride. Outside of the weak launch sequence, Gale Force is intense. The first 3 hills gave some very powerful ejector airtime, and the ride is frenetically paced. And the compact elements will really mess with your equilibrium. And it took a few years, but the coaster is finally smooth, so you can appreciate the intensity without getting a headache. Really, my only issue with the ride, outside of those lackluster launches, are the low and awkward seats. Again, they don't hurt, I just feel a bit uncomfortable in them. They don't feel natural. If I were rating Gale Force after my initial rides in 2017, I would have given the coaster a 6 out of 10, or maybe even a 5 out of 10. The retracking really proved wonders for this ride. So those are my thoughts on Gale Force, the best coaster on the Jersey Shore. What are your thoughts on Gale Force? I would love to hear what you think, and if you rode this coaster, definitely let me know when you rode it because the ride experience has really differed year to year. If you enjoyed this review, I'd appreciate if you gave this video a like and consider subscribing because there'll be a lot more amusement park and roller coaster videos here at Canopy Coaster. Thanks for watching.